The Valkyrie Dominion had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never known defeat because they were the strongest species in the galaxy, and every other civilization had fallen before their mighty fleets and their fearsome warriors. Their homeworld was a paradise of golden towers and crystal seas where the High Tribunal made decisions that affected billions of lives across 1,000 star systems, and when they spoke, the entire galaxy listened, because to ignore the Valkyrie was to invite destruction. The Valkyrie themselves were terrifying creatures that stood 7 feet tall with scales harder than steel and 4 muscular arms that could tear metal apart like paper, and their eyes could see in complete darkness, and their teeth could crush bone. And they had ruled for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. So when their long-range sensors detected small ships crossing into the outer regions of their territory, they were not worried, but merely curious about what primitive species had wandered into their domain. The ships were ugly and slow and made of simple metals, and the Valkyrie scientists laughed when they analyzed the technology because it was so primitive compared to their own advanced systems. Then they discovered who had built these ships, and their laughter stopped. Humans. The Valkyrie had heard stories about humans from traders and explorers who traveled the far edges of the galaxy. And the stories were strange and confusing because humans made no sense to anyone who studied them. They came from a world called Earth, which was a death trap of a planet where everything seemed designed to kill them, and the weather could freeze them or burn them, and the ground could shake and swallow cities, and the water could rise and drown entire nations, and predators hunted them, and diseases plagued them. And yet somehow they had survived. They had soft skin that could be cut by a simple blade, and no claws, and no venom, and no natural armor. And they lived for less than 100 years, which was nothing compared to the 500-year lifespan of a Valkyrie. By every measure, they should have gone extinct long ago, but instead, they had crawled out of their caves and built cities, and then built machines, and then built ships that carried them to the stars. The High Tribunal convened for the first time in 300 years to discuss what to do about these humans who had entered Valkyrie space, and the debate lasted only a few hours because the answer seemed obvious. These creatures were weak and primitive, and they had wandered into territory that belonged to the Dominion, and there was only one response to such an insult. War Ambassador Kethril was chosen to deliver the declaration, personally because the Valkyrie believed in honor and tradition, and they always gave their enemies a chance to surrender before they destroyed them. He traveled to the human diplomatic station at the edge of their territory, and he was not impressed by what he saw because the station was small and simple, and the humans who greeted him were soft and fragile-looking. They led him to a meeting room where a woman waited for him, and she had gray hair and lines on her face that showed her age, and she wore a simple uniform with symbols he did not recognize. Her name was Admiral Chun Weilin, and she was the highest-ranking human military officer in this sector. And she looked at Kethril without any fear in her eyes, which he found strange. He handed her the declaration, which was written on sacred metal in the ancient language of the Dominion, and it stated that humanity had committed crimes against the Valkyrie by entering their space without permission, and that the punishment was total annihilation. Admiral Chun read the declaration slowly, and then she looked up at Kethril, and her expression did not change. "You should reconsider," she said, in a calm voice that carried no emotion. Kethril made a sound that was the Valkyrie version of laughter, and it sounded like stones grinding against each other. "Your species has existed for a mere heartbeat," he said, with contempt dripping from every word. "We have destroyed hundreds of civilizations, and yours will simply be one more forgotten name in our long history of conquest." Admiral Chun set the declaration down on the table between them, and she folded her hands together, and she looked at him with eyes that had seen things he could not imagine. "None of them were us," she said simply. Kethril did not understand what she meant by this, and he did not care, because humans were nothing but insects to be crushed. Beneath the boots of Valkyrie warriors, he returned to his ship and sent the message to the High Tribunal that the humans had refused to surrender and that they should proceed with the invasion as planned. The first fleet assembled within a week, and it was a sight that would have terrified any species in the galaxy because 400 warships stretched across the void like a wall of death, and each ship carried thousands of warriors who had trained their entire lives for combat. 80,000 Valkyrie warriors prepared for what they thought would be an easy victory against primitive creatures who had no hope of fighting back. Fleet Commander Valathus stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the stars blur as they entered faster-than-light travel toward the human colony on Kepler 442b. He had destroyed 12 civilizations in his career, and he expected this one to fall within days, because humans had nothing that could stop the might of the Dominion behind him. His officers checked their weapons and their armor, and they joked about how quickly this war would end and how many humans they would kill. None of them knew that they were sailing toward their own deaths. None of them understood that they had just made the worst mistake in the history of their species. None of them could have imagined that not a single one of them would ever return home. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin watched the Valkyrie ambassador's ship leave the station, and she allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth. She picked up her communicator and sent a single message to every human colony and every human ship and every human military base in the sector. "They're coming." The message said, "Make them regret it." Then she began preparing for a war that would change the galaxy forever. The Valkyrie First Fleet arrived at Kepler 442b on a morning when the twin suns painted the sky in shades of orange and red, and Fleet Commander Valthus thought it was a beautiful day for conquest. The planet below was green and blue, and it reminded him of worlds he had burned before, and he felt nothing but contempt for the creatures who had built their homes there. His sensors showed a small colony of approximately 50,000 humans living in simple structures near the coast, and there were no military bases and no defense platforms and no warships in orbit. "They did not even prepare for us," one of his officers said with amusement. Valthus nodded and gave the order to deploy ground forces because he wanted his warriors to have the pleasure of hunting these humans personally, rather than simply destroying them from orbit. 12,000 Valkyrie warriors loaded into dropships and descended through the atmosphere like meteors falling from the sky, and they landed in the fields outside the human settlement just as the first sun reached its highest point. Commander Vethrak led the ground assault, and he was a veteran of 30 campaigns who had killed more enemies than he could count. And he stepped out of his dropship, expecting to see humans fleeing in terror. But the settlement was empty. The streets were deserted, and the buildings were dark, and there was no sound except the wind blowing through empty doorways. And Vethrak felt a strange sensation in his chest that he did not recognize. "Find them," he ordered his warriors. "They must be hiding somewhere nearby." His forces spread out through the settlement in perfect formation with their weapons ready and their scales gleaming in the sunlight, and they searched every building and every basement and every hiding place they could find. Nothing. The humans had vanished like ghosts. Vethrak was about to order his forces to expand the search when the ground beneath his feet began to shake, and he had just enough time to realize something was wrong before the world exploded. The humans had buried charges beneath the settlement, and they had waited until the maximum number of Valkyrie were inside the kill zone before triggering them, and the explosions were so powerful that warriors were thrown into the air like leaves in a storm. Vethrak survived the initial blast only because he was standing near the edge of the settlement, and he pulled himself to his feet with two of his forearms broken and his scales cracked and bleeding. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. The humans emerged from hidden bunkers and concealed trenches that the Valkyrie sensors had somehow missed, and they came with weapons that should not have been able to hurt Valkyrie warriors, But these were not the plasma weapons or energy beams that civilized species used in combat. These were crude chemical weapons that used explosive powder to fire metal projectiles at incredible speeds, and the projectiles were made of a dense metal called tungsten that punched through Valkyrie scales like they were made of paper. Warriors who had survived 100 battles fell in seconds, as invisible death tore through their formations, and the sound was deafening, and the chaos was absolute. Vethrak tried to rally his forces, but the humans were everywhere, and they moved with a coordination that should have been impossible for a species without a hive link, and they showed no fear even when facing warriors twice their size. He watched a human male charge directly at a group of Valkyrie with a weapon in each hand, and the human was screaming something in his primitive language, and he killed 3 warriors before they cut him down, and even then he kept fighting until his body simply stopped working. Another human female had been shot multiple times, and both of her legs were shattered, and she could not walk or run, but she dragged herself across the ground toward a cluster of Valkyrie warriors with something clutched in her hand. It was a grenade. Vethrak tried to shout a warning, but the explosion came too fast, and 4 more of his warriors died because a wounded human refused to stop fighting. This was not how war was supposed to work. Every species the Valkyrie had conquered had broken eventually, and they had surrendered or fled or begged for mercy when they realized they could not win. But these humans did none of those things. They fought like animals defending their young, and they seemed to welcome death if it meant taking Valkyrie with them, and their eyes held no surrender, only a burning hatred that Vethrak had never seen before. The hive link connected all Valkyrie warriors together and allowed them to share thoughts and feelings and coordinate their actions perfectly. And for the first time in its existence, the hive link carried something new: fear, pure cold fear, spreading from warrior to warrior like a disease, as they watched their brothers die at the hands of creatures they had been told were weak and primitive. By the time the sun set, the ground force was destroyed, and 12,000 Valkyrie warriors lay dead in the ruins of the settlement, and the humans had lost perhaps 2,000 of their own people. But the humans who survived were not celebrating their victory because they knew this was only the beginning. Vethrak was one of the last to die, and he managed to send one final message to the fleet in orbit with his communications device and his base status. Voice was shaking in a way that no Valkyrie voice had ever shaken before. "They don't stop," he said as humans closed in around him. "They don't." The transmission ended. Fleet Commander Valthus stood on his bridge in absolute silence, and he stared at the planet below, and for the first time in his long career he did not know what to do. He sent another wave of warriors, and they died. He sent a third wave, and they died too. By the end of the first day, 18,000 Valkyrie warriors were dead, and the human colony was still standing, and the humans were preparing for the next attack. Valthus finally ordered an orbital bombardment because he could not lose any more warriors to these impossible creatures. But when his ships moved into position, the humans revealed another surprise. Small ships launched from hidden bases on the planet's moons, and they were so fast and so quiet that the Valkyrie sensors barely detected them before they were already inside the fleet's formation. They were not warships. They were missiles with humans inside them. The pilots flew their ships directly into the engines and weapon systems of Valkyrie vessels, and they did not try to survive because survival was not the point. Victory was the point. Revenge was the point. Making sure the Valkyrie never forgot this day was the point. By the time Fleet Commander Valthus managed to retreat, his fleet had lost 60 ships and 40,000 warriors, and he sent a message to the High Tribunal that said only 2 words: "Send reinforcements." He did not know that no amount of reinforcements would ever be enough. The High Tribunal received the news from the First Fleet with disbelief because such a defeat was impossible, and there had to be some mistake because humans were primitive creatures who should have been crushed in hours, not days. They sent the Second Fleet with 600 ships and 100,000 warriors, and they ordered the commander to use different tactics and to learn from the failures of the first assault. The Second Fleet tried orbital bombardment from a safe distance, and they rained fire down on human colonies until the ground itself turned to glass. But when they sent scouts to confirm the destruction, they found empty ruins. The humans had evacuated before the bombardment began, and they had known it was coming, because they had somehow placed spies among the traders who dealt with the Valkyrie, and they had learned to read Valkyrie communications. While the Second Fleet was busy destroying empty colonies, the humans attacked from behind stealth ships that the Valkyrie sensors could not detect, emerged from asteroid fields, and attached themselves to the hulls of Valkyrie vessels, and then humans in armored suits cut their way inside. The fighting in the corridors of Valkyrie ships was worse than anything that had happened on the ground, because the humans had learned how to fight in zero gravity, and they used magnetic boots to walk on walls and ceilings, and they attacked from angles that Valkyrie warriors could not predict. They used industrial tools as weapons, because they had discovered that plasma cutters designed for mining could melt through Valkyrie armor in seconds, and they used explosive charges to seal corridors and trap warriors in sections that they then flooded with toxic gas. One human engineer killed 17 Valkyrie warriors with nothing but a welding torch and a wrench before he was finally stopped, and even then he triggered a bomb that destroyed the entire deck. The Second Fleet lost 300 ships before they managed to retreat, and the survivors spoke of humans who laughed as they died, and who seemed to consider death a small price to pay for victory. The Third Fleet tried a different approach, and they blockaded human supply lines, hoping to starve the colonies into surrender, because surely creatures who needed food and water and air would eventually give up when those things ran out. They were wrong. The humans ate things that no civilized species would consider food, and they grew algae in tanks, and they recycled everything, and they survived on rations that would have killed most other species. Months passed and the blockade held, and the humans grew thin and weak, but they did not surrender when the Valkyrie finally broke through the defensive lines and landed on the colonies. They found that every building was rigged with explosives, and the humans waited until the Valkyrie were deep inside before triggering the charges. Entire cities vanished in nuclear fire, and the humans died alongside their enemies, because they had decided that death was acceptable as long as it meant taking Valkyrie with them. The Third Fleet lost 200,000 warriors and gained nothing. The Fourth Fleet tried biological weapons, because the Valkyrie scientists had created a virus that only affected human biology, and they deployed it on several colonies, hoping it would spread and destroy humanity from within. For 3 weeks it seemed to work, and humans died by the thousands, and the Valkyrie thought they had finally found a weakness they could exploit. Then the humans adapted. Their scientists worked day and night without sleep, and they studied the virus, and they created a cure, and they saved their people. And then they did something that the Valkyrie had not expected. They modified the virus to only affect Valkyrie biology, and they sent infected prisoners back to the Dominion. The plague spread through Valkyrie worlds like wildfire, and millions died before their scientists could create a cure, and the High Tribunal realized with horror that humans did not just fight back. They escalated. Whatever the Valkyrie did to them, they did back worse. High Interrogator Yelmoth was given the task of understanding these impossible creatures, and she spent months studying captured humans and reading their history and analyzing their culture. What she learned terrified her. Humans had been at war with everything since the moment they evolved, and their planet had tried to kill them with ice ages and volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts, and they had survived all of it. They had been hunted by predators larger and stronger than them, and they had killed those predators and eaten them. They had fought diseases that wiped out half their population, and they had survived and grown stronger. They had fought each other in wars that killed millions of their own kind, and they had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and they had somehow managed not to use them. Every generation of humanity had faced extinction, and every generation had survived by being more stubborn and more clever and more vicious than whatever was trying to kill them. Yelmoth presented her findings to the High Tribunal, and her voice shook as she spoke. "We made a terrible mistake," she said. "We thought humans were weak because their bodies are fragile, but their bodies are not what make them dangerous." She showed them images of human history, and they saw wars and plagues and disasters, and through it all the humans kept fighting and kept surviving and kept growing stronger. They're not like other species. Yelmoth continued. Other species fight for territory or resources or dominance, and when the cost becomes too high, they surrender because survival is more important than victory. Humans are different because they will sacrifice everything to win, and they will fight until the last one of them is dead, and they will make sure their enemies pay for every single life they take. She paused and looked at the members of the tribunal with fear in her 4 eyes. "We are not fighting a civilization," she said finally. "We are fighting a species that has spent its entire existence learning how to kill anything that threatens it. And they are very, very good at it. We are the first real threat they have faced since they left their planet. And they are going to destroy us or die trying." The tribunal listened in silence, and for the first time in 12,000 years, they began to understand that they might have finally met an enemy they could not defeat, but they were too proud to admit it, and they sent more fleets to their deaths. The 5th Fleet died in an ambush near the Kepler system, and the 6th Fleet was destroyed when humans detonated a star, and the 7th Fleet vanished without sending a single distress signal, and no one ever discovered what happened to them. The 8th Fleet was the largest force the Dominion had ever assembled, with 1,000 ships and 500,000 warriors, and they were led by Grand Admiral Kethvos, who was the greatest military mind the Velkari had produced in 1,000 years. He studied every battle and every defeat, and he developed new tactics and new weapons, and he was confident that he could finally crush these impossible humans. His fleet entered human space and found nothing, no colonies, and no ships, and no resistance of any kind, and the empty silence was more terrifying than any battle, because the Velkari had learned that when humans were quiet, they were planning something. Kethvos ordered his fleet to hold position while scouts searched for the enemy, but the scouts did not return, and then ships on the edge of his formation began to disappear one by one. The humans had learned to hunt. They had built ships so small and so fast that Velkari sensors could not track them, and they attacked in the darkness, between stars where there was no light and no sound and no warning. Kethvos tried to retreat, but the humans had surrounded his fleet, and every direction led to more ambush and more death. His last transmission was a single word repeated over and over. Everywhere. The 8th Fleet was gone. The High Tribunal met in emergency session, and they debated for 40 hours about what to do. And some wanted to use the silence weapons that could crack planets apart and turn entire solar systems into graveyards. Others argued for negotiation, because surely these humans could be reasoned with, and perhaps a peace treaty could be arranged that would end this disaster. A few members quietly suggested retreat and withdrawal from human space, and pretending this war had never happened, but they were shouted down by those who still believed the Dominion could win. They were still arguing when the alarms began to sound. Somehow human ships had reached the Velkari homeworld. 3 small vessels had crossed 1,000 light years of Dominion space without being detected, and they had slipped past defense networks that had protected the homeworld for millennia, and now they were in orbit above the capital city. The tribunal watched in stunned silence as Admiral Chun Wei-Lin appeared on every screen in the chamber, and her face was calm and her voice was steady, and she looked at them with eyes that held no mercy. "You declared war on humanity," she said. You killed our people and burned our colonies, and you thought we would break and run and beg for our lives." She paused, and the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. "You were wrong." The 3 human ships began deploying thousands of small objects into orbit around the Valkyrie homeworld, and the Tribunal ordered their defense platforms to shoot them down. But the objects were too small and too numerous, and they scattered across the sky like seeds. Then the broadcasts began. Every screen on the planet displayed footage of the war, and the Valkyrie civilians saw what their military had done to human colonies, and they saw the bodies of children and the ruins of cities, and the flames that had consumed innocent lives. But they also saw what had been done to their warriors. They saw Valkyrie soldiers dying by the thousands, and they saw humans fighting with a ferocity that made the mightiest warriors look like frightened children. And they saw the true cost of this war that their leaders had started. The broadcast continued for hours, and the civilians watched in horror as their understanding of the war crumbled, and they realized that their government had lied to them about how easily humanity would fall. Admiral Chun appeared again when the broadcasts ended, and she spoke directly to the Vidarajath. "Valkyrie people, we are not here to destroy you," she said. "We could have brought weapons instead of recorders, and your homeworld would be burning right now, but that is not why we came. We came to deliver a message." She leaned forward, and her eyes seemed to look directly at every Valkyrie. "Watching, stop this war and go home and tell every species in your dominion that Earth is off limits, and tell them that humans do not start wars, but we finish them, and tell them that every fleet you sent is gone, and we are still standing. We have lost friends and family and homes because of your arrogance, and we have every reason to hate you and destroy you and wipe your species from existence. But we are choosing not to. We are choosing to give you one chance to walk away and live, because we are not monsters, even though you tried to make us into them." She stood up straight, and her voice became cold and hard like steel. "But hear this and remember it forever. If a single Valkyrie warship ever enters human space again, we will not send a message next time. We will send a memory. Your species will become a story that mothers tell their children to frighten them, and your name will be spoken in whispers for the next 12,000 years as a warning about what happens to those who threaten humanity. You have one chance, and this is it, and I suggest you take it." The transmission ended, and the 3 human ships vanished into the darkness between stars before any Valkyrie vessel could intercept them. The High Tribunal sat in silence for a long time. Then they voted. The war was over. The Dominion withdrew from human space, and they never returned, and they told every species they controlled that Earth and its colonies were forbidden territory that no one should ever approach. The humans had won, not through superior technology or greater numbers, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to give up, combined with a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. They had shown the galaxy that they were not prey. They were predators, and predators do not run from anything. 300 years had passed since the war ended, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Valkyrie Dominion still existed, but it was a shadow of what it had once been, because the war had broken something inside them that could never be repaired, and their empire had shrunk as species they had once controlled found the courage to break free. Humans had expanded across the stars and built an alliance with dozens of species who had heard the story of how they had defeated the mighty Valkyrie and wanted to be their friends rather than their enemies. Earth had become a symbol of hope for the oppressed and a warning for the powerful. In the great library of the Valkyrie homeworld, a young historian named Kethral VII worked on what he considered his life's most important project, a complete and honest history of the human war. He was descended from the ambassador who had delivered the original declaration of war 3 centuries ago, and he had grown up hearing stories about the conflict. But he had always suspected that those stories did not tell the whole truth. So he had spent 20 years digging through archives and interviewing survivors and collecting every piece of evidence he could find, and what he had learned changed him forever. The official history claimed that the war had been a minor border conflict that ended in a negotiated peace. But Kethral 7 knew that was a lie designed to protect Valkyrie pride. The truth was far more devastating. 9 fleets had been sent to crush humanity, and 9 fleets had been destroyed, and over 3,000 ships and more than 2 million warriors had died in a war that had lasted less than 2 years. The Dominion had thrown everything it had at a species they considered primitive and weak, and they had lost so completely that they had been forced to beg for mercy from the very creatures they had tried to exterminate. Kethral 7 had read the recovered black boxes from destroyed ships, and he had listened to the final transmissions of warriors who had faced humans in combat, and every recording told the same story. Fear Valkyrie warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds, screaming in terror as humans came for them with weapons and tools and bare hands, and a fury that nothing could stop. He had studied the testimonies of the few prisoners who had eventually been returned, and they spoke of humans who had treated them with respect and even kindness, but who had made it absolutely clear that any further aggression would be met with total annihilation. One prisoner had asked his human captor why they fought so hard, and the answer had stayed with Kethral 7 ever since he first read it: because we have nothing else. The human had said, "We are small and weak, and we live for such a short time, and the universe is vast and cold and full of things that want to kill us. So we learned to fight back against everything, because if we didn't, we would have died long ago on a planet that tried to murder us every single day. You thought our weakness made us easy targets, but you were wrong, because our weakness made us strong, and our mortality made us brave, and our fragility made us dangerous. We are the children of extinction events, and every single one of us carries the genes of survivors who refuse to give up when everything seemed hopeless. You cannot break us because we have already been broken 1,000 times, and we always put ourselves back together and come back stronger." Kethral 7 included this quote in his book because he believed it explained everything about why the war had ended the way it did. The Valkyrie had assumed that a species so fragile would be easy to destroy, but they had not understood that fragility was what made humans so dangerous. A species that lived for 500 years could afford to be patient and wait for better opportunities, but humans who only lived for 100 years, at most, could not afford to wait for anything. They had to fight now with everything they had, because tomorrow might never come, and because death was always so close to them. They did not fear it the way other species did, and they were willing to sacrifice their short lives for victory in ways that the long-lived Valkyrie could not comprehend. Kethral 7 finished his book with a warning to future generations of Valkyrie. Let our history be a lesson to all who come after us. He wrote, "There are species in this galaxy that conquer, and there are species that survive, and we believe we were both, but we were wrong. We were only conquerors, and when we met a species that was truly designed for survival, we discovered that conquest means nothing against an enemy who would rather die than submit. The humans taught us that there are worse things than death, and one of them is living with the knowledge that you started a fight you could not finish. We declared war on humanity, and not a single enemy ever came back alive. And that is not because humans are cruel or savage or monstrous. It is because they refuse to lose. They refuse to surrender. They refuse to be victims. And when faced with that kind of determination, even the mightiest empire in the galaxy could not stand. Let us never forget this lesson, and let us never repeat the mistake of our ancestors who looked at humanity and saw prey when they should have seen predators. The humans are watching the stars even now, and they remember what we did to them, and they will never forget. And if we ever give them a reason to come for us again, they will not stop until we are nothing but a memory. This is the truth our leaders tried to hide, and this is the truth that must be told so that we never make the same mistake twice. The book was published and became the most controversial work in Valkyrie history, and many tried to ban it and destroy all copies, but it spread anyway, because truth has a way of surviving even when powerful people want it dead. And across the galaxy, other species read the book and learned the lesson that the Valkyrie had learned the hard way. Do not threaten humanity. Do not attack their homes. Do not harm their children, because if you do, they will come for you with fire and fury, and they will not stop until justice is done. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they are not the oldest or the wisest or the most advanced. But they are survivors, and that makes them the most dangerous thing in the universe.